I'm very happy to introduce Professor Martin Stokhof, who is an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, and Jin Yuelin, professor of logic at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Thank you so much for joining us, Martin, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the introduction. We begin with thanking the Institute for the invitation to spend a month here. I'm very happy to be here. With lots of interesting things going on, and lots of interesting people to meet and to talk to. And so, thank you all also for joining. So what follows is a general outline of the paper that I'm planning to write. It doesn't contain very much details, and I left out all references to the extensive literature that I will be drawing on, and leave that for the paper. Okay. So this is the overview. I'll say something about the background of the paper, a conceptual analysis, then introduce two particular views on how concepts function, namely conceptual engineering and what is called traveling concepts, discuss some of their resemblance and differences, and then introduce a test case, something to make it slightly more concrete, see how these two views on concepts differ and maybe also coincide when we're talking about the concept of understanding as we apply it in the context of generative AI systems. So conceptual analysis. Philosophy, certainly in the analytical tradition, is by and large conceptual analysis, and that has a factual background. The expansion and success of science and its methods has left physics, astronomy, biology, psychology outside the realm of philosophy and into disciplines of their own. Most recent, the rise of cognitive neuroscience has given birth to things like neuroaesthetics, neuroethics, neuroepistemology. So the question is, what is left for philosophy to be about? Now, one of the driving forces around the move towards conceptual analysis is a scientific conviction, namely that it is science and science only that delivers reliable knowledge. Now, within the analytical tradition, this has led to two movements. There's a negative withdrawal and say, well, basically, philosophy is just a bunch of misunderstandings. And the thing that philosophers need to do is to apply some form of radical self-therapy and liberate philosophy from itself. And the positive withdrawal is that, well, there's still room for something to do, namely conceptual analysis. Now, the standard form, and this is glossing over a rich variety of different approaches, but just to get to the very basics, basic assumption is that there are right concepts that, so to speak, carve nature at its joints, and that successful science is successful because it uses the right concepts. And philosophy is then left with the task to investigate concepts and to try to find out what makes them right and what makes them wrong. But that's a very descriptive and analytical enterprise. Some people have taken that one step further. They say, well, basically, conceptual analysis is slightly more important than just looking at what science does. It's really a prolegomena to successful science in some cases. So conceptual analysis there is prior and to and indispensable for scientific investigation. Because philosophers have the unique capability of being able to rule on what are meaningful concepts, what makes sense or what does not. And so they exploit a kind of expertise that is different from scientific expertise. So this is prescriptive and analytic. Of course, that raises a lot of questions. Is there always a nature with joints? That might seem a plausible assumption when we're dealing with natural sciences. But for example, in the social sciences, in the humanities, it's not quite clear what that actually might be. And also another question is, what kind of expertise do philosophers bring to the table that scientists lack? I mean, there may be a division of labor, but is there something particular special about philosophy that we cannot find in science? Now, even one step further is to say, basically, there is no special philosophical domain, there's no special philosophical method. Philosophy is engaged in the same kind of enterprise as all the other sciences, and the differences that exist, and they do exist, are of a quantitative, not of a qualitative nature. Now, that's the kind of analysis that is purely descriptive and joins the sciences in pursuing explanation of empirical phenomena. Now, that raises another set of questions, but we don't need to go into that here. Now, conceptual engineering. The main claims of conceptual engineering is that there are certain concepts, and stock examples are concept of gender, race, but also a concept, epistemological concept like truth, do not derive from reality in a value-free way. They have, of course, links to things in reality, but they don't correspond in the way in which ordinary scientific concepts do. Within that sphere, for example, we're talking about gender and sex, there are good concepts and there are bad concepts. And good concepts are those that promote worthy moral or political goals, and bad ones are the ones that obstruct their realization. And that gives philosophy a completely different status. It should not just analyze concepts, it should design concepts that replace good concepts that replace the bad ones, or ameliorate concepts. Now, this is a kind of analysis that is prescriptive for example, scientific endeavor, but also for political discourse, and so on and so forth. And it is constructive. It doesn't just analyze what's there, but it creates something that is of its own. Now, that's a very interesting undertaking, and is something that is very much en vogue within analytical philosophy at the moment. But it's an enterprise that does raise some questions. For example, what actually determines whether a concept is better than another? Or are the old concepts to be replaced by entirely new ones? And then how do we make the transition? Or is there also room for gradual improvement, where we sort of keep something of the old concept, but specify it change it in certain ways? So that's about what conceptual engineering is about, what its scope is. But it's an enterprise that also actually wants to change something. So that raises the question of effectiveness. How do you affect conceptual change? And what motivates the way in which you do it? And what are the conditions under which conceptual change can actually be brought about? Of course, concepts do change. They change in the context of scientific investigation, but they also change in much more indirect ways, by being influenced by the results of science, for example, or by being influenced by the results of certain political developments. So the question of, okay, if we are to change concepts, how do we do that, and how can we do that in an effective way, is an important question that is raised by conceptual engineering. Another question is the expertise. Why should that be an exclusively philosophical affair? Why do philosophers have something special to say about that? Again, if we look at actual conceptual changes, we see that they are brought about. They stem from a rich variety of sources. Some of them may be philosophical, but they're certainly not exclusively philosophical. And finally, there's the aspect of normativity. This is an explicitly normative enterprise. But what kind of normative authority is required here, and who has that authority? Okay. Now, I want to contrast this particular approach to how concepts work and what philosophy has to say and do about them with another one, which is called traveling concepts. Now, the term actually derives from the Dutch scholar called Mieke Bal, who devised the term in the context of her work in cultural analysis. We use it in a broader context. The background of my interest in that particular view on concepts is the search for a philosophy that is not modeled on science, that is not simply a restrictive therapeutic enterprise, and that is also not based on the assumption of normative authority. Because I think that all three assumptions are ineffective or simply wrong. But it should be something that is substantial, something that deals with real phenomena, that is cooperative, so doesn't make any claim to being special, and that is modest, that doesn't make a claim to any special authority. The time that philosophers declare things ex cathedra is left behind and should be, and rightly so. Now, the key methodology argued in another paper is philosophical analysis as a method of bringing about aspect change. But in view of the time, I'm going to skip the slides that deal with that and go straight to the notion of a traveling concept. So what are traveling concepts? These are concepts, and that's what the term traveling is supposed to suggest, that are intrinsically context dependent, right? So they really change in terms of what they apply to, depending on the context in which they are used. And the connections between different uses in different contexts are really of the kind of a family resemblance, that Wittgensteinian concept, where there are no essential characteristics, no necessary and sufficient criteria for the application of a concept, of a concept where that changes from one context to the other. And of course, concepts apply to things, to entities of a variety of natures, but they are not determined by that. So the concepts are not simply what something is, but they always reflect the kind of interest that something has for us. So the concept is not what X is, but what X is for us. And of course, that's a mix of what is out there and what we bring to bear in looking at what's out there and why that is important for us and under which circumstances that is important for us. It's interesting to note that if you look at terms that stand for traveling concepts, that these are typically gradable terms, right? They apply to a certain extent. For example, as we will see, the concept of understanding is something that you can grade. You understand it completely or to some extent or poorly or in a limited way. And they are also relative. So the criteria for applying such terms are relative to a comparison class. We talk about understanding, good understanding for an undergraduate student or a young child, or for example. Now, of course, with gradable terms and relative terms, there's always the possibility of precisification, right? You can add the grades, you can specify the comparison class and make something more precise, but that doesn't eliminate the context dependency. But the context dependency is really, in a sense, a blessing and it is a curse. It's a curse because it obfuscates differences, and it's a blessing because it shows you resemblances between these different uses. So the fact that we use one term and use it in a variety of ways depending on context shows that there is a connection, but it also tends to obfuscate the fact that the uses are actually different, at least different to a certain extent. And not noticing those differences, of course, leads to various kinds of misunderstandings. Okay. Now, if you look at traveling concepts and conceptual analysis, key differences are that traveling concepts still are committed to some kind of ontological basis, whereas, the conceptual analysis, whereas the traveling concepts really take their starting point from a practice theoretical perspective. And that shows up in, for example, that one is focused on explanation, whereas the other is more a kind of phenomenological description, the mono versus multidimensionality, and the non-normative versus a practical normativity that is included in this notion of a traveling concept, because what something is for us also reflects the values that we attach to it, be they practical values, positive or negative. Conceptual engineering, well, and traveling concepts, they share a concern for practical considerations in addition to theoretical ones. And so in that sense, they move beyond the scientism that informs traditional conceptual analysis. But there are also differences. The traveling concepts view has no attachment to notions of correctness and objectivity in the strict sense, and no exclusive reliance on propositional kinds of knowledge. And it doesn't have a form of normative directedness. No, there's no preconceived hierarchy of good and bad, which is exactly what informs the conceptual engineering approach. Okay.
Martin, yeah, oh yeah, that's what I was. I was asking you, could you please give us just one or two examples to illustrate these categories you just showed in the last slide?
The traveling concepts and the conceptual engineering.
Yes, some concepts that are traveling and not, and
okay.
Have no attachment. So you clarify for me now.
Yeah, well, the traveling concept, I'll give you an example on the next slide. The conceptual engineering typically deals with concepts like gender or race, things that, of course, have a factual component, refer to underlying biological phenomena, but also have a social component. And there are good and bad ways of explicating those concepts. And that's what conceptual engineering does. Now, I think gender and race are pretty straightforward examples, but it's also applied to a concept like truth, for example, which may come. Well, it's not so obvious that there are good and bad notions of truth, but people have argued for that. But let me illustrate the traveling concepts idea with the notion of understanding. So I want to look at the concept of understanding as it plays a role in our discussions of generative AI systems. Now, there are lots of questions, technical, conceptual, existential questions raised. I will not have anything to say about the technical questions, but I think because they need to be left really to the experts. But I think in terms of the conceptual questions and certainly the existential questions, these are questions that we as non-experts, not as the people who actually devise these systems, but as people who use them or who are affected by other people using them, have something to say about. Things like, so do generative AI systems have consciousness? Do they have intentions? Do they have agency, creativity? Should they be given rights? Now, these involve concepts like consciousness, intentionality, and that are typically traveling concepts that, depending on what you apply them, they start to have different meanings. Now, I focus on understanding as a key concept because I think it plays a role also in all these others. Oh, um, the 20 minutes are now gone, so I'll just wrap it up very quickly. Uh, so basically, when it comes to understanding, do generative AI systems understand that various positions? One extreme says, well, they're mainly parroting the data on which they are trained. And the others say, no, they really understand the questions that are asked and the answers that they produce. Now, question here is that the kind of understanding that we attribute to humans? Uh, if you look at the actual discussions, then many of them are conducted in absolute terms. So understanding is having a particular type of representation. And then you go and look at the generative AI system and say, yes, it has, or no, it doesn't. Or the ability to solve particular kinds of problems. And the problem here is that all these various positions in this discussion start from the assumption that understanding has an essence, right? That there is something that understanding is. Uh, now, if we look at the concept of understanding as we apply it to humans, then we see, for example, that it comprises both know-how and know-that it manifests itself both in verbal and in non-verbal action, that it often requires some body of embodiment, that it is intrinsically contextual, that it is gradable, that it is relative, and that it is connected with practical concerns. And that's not a finite list. So what understanding is for us may, or to some extent, or maybe in all of it, extent, apply to all these different kinds of features. And the question then becomes, which of these aspects of understanding do we require of generative AI systems to be able to say that they really understand in the way in which we do that? Okay, I think that is a more productive way of looking at the matter. So in order to count as one of us, as something that has understanding, agency, intentionality, rights, and so on and so forth, generative systems need to sort of live with us in the same way as we live with other human beings, at least to a sufficient extent. And then it makes complete sense to apply the concepts that we apply to ourselves also to these systems. Because after all, the generative AI is not a matter of nature. It's a matter of our own making, which doesn't mean that we will always be its masters. Because in the end, being human is also a traveling concept. But we may extend that in certain ways that we cannot foresee at present. Now, this is the overall structure of the paper. I want to write it in, just sum it up, along two lines. So basically, write it in an essay form with an underlying structure that contains all the necessary references to the existing literature and the discussions there. But that will be an addition to a layer that will be more like an essay that is hopefully also interesting to read for non-philosophers. Okay, thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments and objections, especially the latter ones.
Great. Thank you, Martin. Any questions from the audience? Yes, study.
Yeah, well, thank you, Martin. I understand that we must clarify exactly in what arena we speak about something, because the context of use determines the nature of the concept in a way, right? But
Yeah.
so my first question was, are not all concepts traveling concepts to some extent? And that was what I was wondering about. And the other one about this issue of applying this to AI. I mean, and that was also a conclusion of the international intercontinental academia we had here. Is we seem to think that AI is meaning something while it recovers a lot of very diverse, phenomena, and perhaps. Just like a rule is defined also by its domain of application, what we apply to is also something that needs to be very clearly defined, not the nature of the concept. And so, how do you deal with this? The fact that how much a concept is traveling or is precise, or I'm trying to get back to the definition that you were giving in the beginning, depends also on the definition of the object to which it is applied.
Yep. I think you're completely right. Well, aren't all concepts traveling? Well, I think that certainly traditional conceptual analysis in analytical philosophy takes its cue from the idea of a concept as something that is really definable in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. And there you see reflections of the enormous prestige that mathematics has had in the Western tradition for many, many, many millennia, actually. Right? Because if you're looking for really precisely defined concepts, those are the first instances that you come up with. And of course, in the natural sciences, in physics, people strive after concepts that are as clearly defined as the concepts in mathematics. And that's also what makes the application of mathematical theories so very successful in the context of physics, for example, because that deals with the kind of phenomena that minimally lend themselves to fixing them, certainly within the context of a theory. The more you go to phenomena that are intrinsically social or human in nature, the more they display these features of being traveling concepts. Now, the whole notion of a traveling concept is itself a gradual one. So there's also that dimension that some concepts may be more traveling than others. Your second question with regard to application, if I understand you correctly, yes, there are two sides to this discussion about the nature and the impact of generative AI systems. Is what do we apply them to, which I think is also, we shouldn't forget that question, is also concerned with why do we apply them to what we apply them? So why do we do that? What do we want to gain from that or learn from that? So, in that sense, a good definition of the application area is needed for these questions to become questions that we can meaningfully discuss, certainly. But also the kind of concepts that we apply in that discussion need to be specified And of course, we can say, well, so there's this famous quip from I think from the 70s, where someone says, AI, no, intelligence is the next thing that AI cannot do, right? Everybody says, well, oh, now they can do this. Yeah, but that's not really intelligence, right? So as an escape hatch. But you can also turn that around. You say, well, intelligence is being able to solve these kinds of problems. And that's certainly an aspect of it. But if we want to apply the concept of intelligence or understanding in ways that really connect with the way in which we use it on our own and apply it to ourselves, and then we need to take into account this contextual nature and the fact that it differs from context to context what we count as understanding. I hope that.
Thank you.
Great. And Vladimir.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this presentation, Martin. It's a very interesting one. I have just one question. It's a kind of development of the side question too. I'm not very convinced with this idea of a traveling concept because if I understood the project, it's a certain way, it's a question of avoid ontology of concepts or something like that. And you make out even a distinction on ontology, conceptual engineering, praxis, and pragmatics. Traveling concepts. But I'm not, I'm not, for me, it's not very clear what is exactly, for example, when you define this distinction, because a realistic perspective, what X is, and a more pragmatic perspective, what X is for us, I don't have the clear distinction of what exactly us in this context. Who are us in this context? No? And how I can let's say, how I can know who are ourselves. No? Because if we accept, my question is, if we accept that concept is not a question of a definition, it's a question of a process, there's a historical process of clarification of concepts, then even this us for us change historically. And if this can even change in a very broader sense, in the way that we can even insist that us is everybody in a certain way. And if us is everybody, there will be also an ontology for us. You know? And then I would just understand a little bit more what you think about it.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's of course a very an excellent question that goes right to the heart of the matter. And in the slides that I skipped, I tried to say something about that. It's not that the idea of what something is for us divests it completely, separates it completely from reality, right? Because our concepts are applied to things in reality. But what I want to sort of emphasize is that in that application, there is also something that we bring to the table. So it's not just a matter of how reality is, it's also a matter of, well, which parts of reality are important to us, how we view those parts. And that is something that can change over time. So there are constraints to the kinds of concepts that we can have. And these constraints are just given by the world in which we live. And they are also given by the kinds of creatures that we are. Our biology and our basic psychology defines the space of concepts that we could develop. Within that space, there is room for plurality. I always think of this as a form of pluralism that doesn't collapse into complete relativism, because the space of conceptual structures that we can employ is definitely restricted by what works for us in reality. But that doesn't mean that doesn't sort of force upon us a unique set of concepts that mimic reality, or that are completely forced by external reality upon us. And if we look at, well, I mean, the history of our intellectual development, if we look even at contemporaneous different cultures, different communities, we see that there is room for the kind of diversity that I try to capture in this, what it is for us. So the us it can be us humans, but it can also be us Western people living in the 21st century. It can be us people living in Africa in the 6th century. Right? I hope that makes it clear. So there are restrictions. You're absolutely right about that, but there's room for diversity.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.